Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each week of this podcast is either an episode with one or more guests, or a solo episode where I unpack some scholarship in relation to computer science education. In this week's episode, I'm unpacking the paper titled 2021 State of Computer Science Education, Accelerating Action Through Advocacy. This particular paper was developed in collaboration between Co.org, specifically the Advocacy Coalition, with the Computer Science Teachers Association, CSTA, and ESEP, which is the Expanding Computing Education Pathways. I'll include links to each of those organizations in the show notes, which you can find at jaredoleary.com, or by clicking the link in the app that you're listening to this on. All right, so normally I read off an abstract, but what I'm going to do is actually read off the first paragraph of the executive summary, and this is on page 1, which is PDF page 5. Quote, just 51% of high schools offer computer science, up from 35% in 2018. This represents tremendous progress by teachers, school leaders, policymakers, and other advocates. But given the significance of computing in today's society, it is inadequate that half of the schools lack even a single course. And new data reveals that disparities exist for who has access to and who participates in computer science education. Policy clearly matters, as states with more computer science policies in place have more schools offering computer science and more students taking it. It is important for policymakers, industry leaders, and advocates to accelerate action by advocating for policies that make computer science a fundamental part of the education system. End quote. If I were to summarize this into a single sentence, I'd say that this paper is an annual report on the state of K-12 CS in the United States. It was authored by Co.org, CSTA, and ESEP. Now, in the executive summary, which again starts on page 1, they've got some highlights of some of the data. So there's some really interesting findings if you just take a look at it. Like, for example, of the 37 states that have this kind of data, only 4.7% of high school students are enrolled in foundational computer science courses. There's also other data, such as female students make up 49% of the elementary CS students, 44% of middle school, and 31% of high school students who are enrolled in a foundational computer science course. So it's data like that that's really interesting to look at. So I highly recommend checking out this report, which I do include a direct link to in the show notes. Now on page 4, there's an interesting quote in here that says, quote, in spring 2020, 18% of surveyed K-12 computer science teachers reported temporary suspension of computer science instruction, disproportionately affecting higher poverty schools, rural schools, and schools serving large populations of Black, African American, Hispanic, Latino, Latina, Latinx, and Native American students, end quote. Now, this is interesting. So this is actually citing a KPOR Center and CSTA report on COVID's impact on CS education. And I'm honestly surprised it's not a higher number, because I know even now there are some schools where they have 20 plus teachers out every day. So because of that, some of the computer science educators that I know are having to cover other quote core content areas. So instead of teaching their CS classes, they're still having to do English classes, because on the priority scale, CS is still lower priority compared to read and write and arithmetic. And we can problematize that all we want, but it's just interesting. I honestly would have thought it would have been higher, especially in spring of 2020 when remote learning was a new thing for a lot of people. But maybe I'm just bringing in my experiences with music education and thinking of my music educator friends who literally were not allowed to teach their classes because with vocal projection and whatnot and playing an instrument, you're using a lot of air. And because we didn't really understand COVID, a lot of music classes were canceled because there weren't adequate ways to have face coverings and whatnot, or to social distance when you have 100 kids in a class who are all singing standing right next to each other. Okay, on the next page, which is page 5, but PDF page 9, so this kind of highlights the 9 policies to make computer science fundamental within a particular state. So the 9 policies are as follows, and this is going to be direct quotes of what it's stated. So for number 1, it's create a state plan for K-12 computer science. Number 2 is define computer science and establish rigorous K-12 computer science standards. Number 3 is to allocate funding for computer science teacher professional learning. Number 4 is to implement clear certification pathways for computer science teachers. Number 5 is to create pre-service programs in computer science at higher education institutions. Number 6 is to establish computer science supervisor positions in education agencies. Number 7 is to require that all high schools offer computer science. Number 8 is to allow a computer science credit to satisfy a core graduation requirement. Number 9 is to allow computer science to satisfy a higher education admission requirement. Now, while I really agree with and understand these, a critique that I have is that it focuses primarily on high schools. So for example, number 7, requiring all high schools offer computer science is a very different requirement than saying requiring all schools K through 12, or even pre-K through 12, offer computer science, computational thinking, whatever, however you want to phrase it. But the point is like expanding beyond just the high school offerings. Now, another thing that I'll point out is like number 3, so allocate funding for computer science professional learning. While that's a great goal, and if we go all the way down to page 43 and we look at my home state, Arizona, for this particular one, it says, yeah, there's funding, and it says that there's $4.7 million for CS since 2016. However, if you actually go and look at the grants that have been offered, at least in Arizona, all of the ones that I've seen have been specifically for high school professional development and are not applicable through the K-8 classes and K-8 educators. So while I think it's like awesome for states to follow these policies, I think it'd be nice to also encourage that these 9 different policies are not just targeted towards high school, however a state implements it. But that's a good starting place, I guess. So it's better than nothing. Now, interestingly, if we scroll a little bit further down to page 7, so it says that at this point, all 50 states and Washington, D.C. now have computer science as counting towards a graduation requirement, and that 3 states in particular, Arkansas, South Carolina, and Nevada, require that all students take at least one computer science course before graduation. Now that's really interesting, and I'm going to get into a little bit of a rant towards the end of this episode that kind of talks about some of my thoughts on that. So, little teaser for you. Okay, so the next several pages of this particular document kind of talk about like some of the statewide things going on. So, for example, some governors are partnering to promote computer science education, but interestingly, that number is only 8 Republicans, 7 Democrats who are currently holding office, and then 5 Republicans and 3 Democrats who formerly held office. So it's not like a ton. And this commitment, again, focuses on high school. These 3 policies are ensuring that all high schools offer computer science, providing funding for teacher professional development, and developing a set of K-12 standards. Although in other episodes, I have problematized standards, I think this is a good sign for promoting computer science in the classroom. So having K-12 computer science standards is great that it's K-12, not just high school. But the first key policy of ensuring all high schools offer computer science, I wish that was expanded to all pre-K through 12 offered computer science. But I know that's obviously harder to do, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. And the reason why I, again, think it's important to expand that is because that second policy of providing funding could make a governor go, well, why would we provide funding for K through 8 when really we're all about high school right now. So let's just focus on that. And so they might do what Arizona did, where they just provide funding for high school. So the next section in here is talking about like federal policies and whatnot. So it has mentioned that there's been over $190 billion for K-12 education, and computer science is one of the subject areas that will be able to spend some of these funds over the next few years. So if you are a researcher or organization who is interested in doing federally funded grants, then it looks like you might have the opportunity to get some funds, which is awesome. And by the way, if you are the kind of person who's interested in doing grants, so am I. Although I try to not mention it, I do have a PhD, happy to do some research. So if you've listened to some of these interviews and solo episodes and you feel like we kind of resonate or are on the same wavelength, feel free to contact me using the button on my website. Happy to chat about what grants you're interested in. All right, and then the final subsection of this particular section of the paper is titled Looking Back and Looking Forward. So in this section, they give a few different recommendations for the field. And so I'm going to kind of read each one of these. So one recommendation is, quote, as computer science access and participation increases, work to ensure that it reaches students from the populations that are currently underrepresented, end quote. From page 10. Now, interestingly, one of the things that I like that they point out is that the impact of the switch to remote learning has really kind of helped some schools actually get some devices and internet, or at least improved devices and improved internet in their schools and able for kids to take home. So this has actually helped out computer science education, where previously some districts might not have had the ability to actually have one-to-one devices. However, there's still an underrepresentation of people who are tending to participate in computer science, at least according to some of the data that is in this particular study. So here's a quote that's also from page 10. Quote, compared to pre-pandemic states, the percentage of district leaders reporting one-to-one devices, i.e. one device per student, in middle and high school increased from 66% to 90%, and at the elementary level, it increased from 42% to 84%. Education Superhighway has now achieved its goal of broadband access in every school and has shifted its focus to the homework gap, or student access at home, end quote. So that's actually like a really great sign. I mean, for the elementary level, it's like doubled the number of devices, or at least the percentage. And then we had a 24% increase for middle and high school. So even though obviously COVID has had a huge negative impact on many people, it has also had some positive impacts in areas like this, which is great. All right, so the second recommendation that they provide is to, quote, leverage student devices, school broadband access, and educator experience, teaching with technology to expand access to and participation in computer science, end quote. It's from page 11. Now, for people who are interested in grants, one of the things that they do say on page 10 is, quote, in the future, virtual offerings could provide a possible solution to some of the challenges with computer science access, particularly for rural or small schools that do not yet have the capacity to offer computer science courses in person, end quote. So if you are somebody who is working on grants, this is an important thing to consider. If you're trying to do some broadening participation, maybe you should consider broadening participation in rural or small schools that don't have CS right now because of devices, internet, or whatever. All right, so the next section of here is talking about K-8 computer science. And so interestingly, it said that 40% of all the CS for all grants from NSF that were awarded in 2020 and 2021 were specifically focused on pre-K-8 computer science education. Now, one of the things that they mention in here is that there's this tendency to misunderstand some prior CS education or CS experience with like some kind of a natural aptitude. And so they point out that, quote, boys are more likely to come to school with prior computer science experiences from outside of school and are more likely to be encouraged by a teacher or parent to take computer science, end quote. So this is really important to consider when trying to recruit kids to join your CS program, is thinking through some of the biases you might have that you might misattribute to, oh, well, this particular kind of person has a natural aptitude for engaging in CS. When really it might just be they have more access at home or more experience or exposure to it, which is why they have recommendation number 3, which is, quote, create full K-12 pathways for computer science to lay a foundation for more diverse enrollment and retention in high school courses, end quote, from page 12. Now again, a critique is that they have a heavy emphasis on high school courses and increasing enrollment there. However, they do have some state level policies that are increasingly focused on the K-8 space. And so these policies, this is from page 12, are, quote, prioritizing or dedicating funding to K-8, requiring all K-8 schools to teach computer science, creating K-8 course codes in computer science, hiring a state employee to focus solely on K-8 computer science implementation, requiring all pre-service elementary teacher preparation programs to include computer science and computational thinking content, and replacing K-12 teacher certifications with grade band specific certifications, end quote. Again, from page 12. I'm definitely biased, but I definitely agree with a lot of these, that we need to focus on this more. And then the last recommendation that they provide that's also on page 12 is, quote, prioritize teaching foundational computer science to ensure all students are prepared for various advanced pathways, end quote. So you might be wondering, well, what exactly does that mean? So they clarify that there's like a bunch of new pathways that people can take that are related to AI or cybersecurity or data science, etc. So it would be helpful to have a foundation in computer science, broadly speaking, before diving into those areas. I would, however, argue that even though it's easier to teach a class when you can assume prerequisites, I think it could create a barrier to entry that would be unnecessary to learn cybersecurity, AI, data science, etc. Yes, it would be helpful, but if we run into prereqs, kind of like what we have with some of the AP computer science courses with like prereqs of, hey, you have to have passed a certain math class, that can prevent some people from actually being able to participate. So just have to be very intentional and think through whether or not we want prereqs in any of the classes that we're working with. All right, so the next section that starts on page 13 is really kind of talking about, okay, nationwide, what's been going on in this last year? How have things changed? I'm going to kind of read off some of the stats that are on here. So what's interesting is for the first main section, this is from page 16. This is on the percentage of public high schools offering foundational computer science. So in 2018, it was 35%, but in 2021, it's 51%. However, when we go to a geographic percentage, in urban schools, it's 48%. In suburban schools, it's 61%. In a town, it's 46%. And in rural populations, it's 49%. And then when we look at free and reduced lunch, for schools with less than 24%, it's 57% of schools. Then if we look at the other end of the continuum, schools with greater than 75%, it's only in 41%. So there's a very clear difference depending on if you're in a suburban or urban school versus rural, as well as if you are free and reduced lunch or not. Now, at the bottom of that page on page 16, they have some more demographics, and what they do is they relate it between like the student population demographics versus enrolled in CS. So for example, English language learners, like the student population is 10%, but only 6% of them are enrolled in CS. Students with the 504 plans, the student population is 2.7%, But in CS classes, it's actually 3.5%, so it's higher than, which is a really interesting finding. And I'd honestly like to learn more about that. Like why? For students under IDEA, it's 14% who are the student population, but only 9% are enrolled. And then if we look at what they call economically disadvantaged students, it's 52% for the population, but only 38% are enrolled. And that's for the K-12. Now, if we look at grades 9 through 12 in particular, and this is across like 35 different states, so this is looking at race or ethnicity. So for student population, it's 15% Black or African American, and 16% are enrolled in CS. So it means it's higher. We look at Hispanic, Latino, Latina, and Latinx, 26% compared to 19% enrolled. For Native American or Alaskan, it's 1% compared to 1.2% enrolled. For Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders, it's matched at 0.4%. We look in Asian, it's 5%, and then 12% are enrolled, so more than double the percent. If we look at white, it's both at 48% of population and enrolled. And then if we look at 2 or more races, it's 4% versus 3% enrolled. So it's interesting to see where there's like some where it's like very similar or same percentages, and then others where there's like either significantly more or significantly less. And I'll talk about this more a little bit later on about, well, why is that? And what can we do about that? Or should we do something about that? Again, a teaser. Now, on the next page, the authors mentioned that there are different organizations or even like funded grants will try and improve or broaden participation in different ways. So this could include like policy advocacy. It could be providing PD for teachers in high need areas, or even developing culturally relevant curriculum. All right, so in the next section, there's a little discussion on Native American reservations and schools that have CS education offerings on there. At the high school level, in foundational computer science courses, 20% of the 175 schools on Native American reservations had CS courses. And then there are specific organizations and even projects that are mentioned on there. And interestingly enough, the NSF project on the Wind River Elementary Computer Science Collaborative, actually one that I'm working on, so I'm developing the curriculum for it. I'll include a link to some of the resources that we've created, some of the like promotional videos that kind of demonstrate what we're doing. So check that out in the show notes. It's a pretty cool project. And I'll also include a link to some of the Scratch projects so you can see some of the student artwork, which was created by these students on the Wind River Reservation, which has both Northern Arapaho and Eastern Shoshone people. There's some amazing artwork and student creations that we have permission to share publicly. All right, so then they have a little section on students with disabilities, and they again mention that the 504 students have a higher overrepresentation in the high school courses, which is interesting, but the IEPs are slightly underrepresented. All right, so that was mostly at the high school level. So the next section is on K-8 participation, and they actually do mention the nonprofit that I work for, Boot Up, in there. So you want to read more about that, you can see some of our impact. It's interesting looking at those numbers because I know we're higher than that now in terms of the impact that we've had and the reach. However, what's really interesting on pages 21 and 22 is that the spread between some different demographics, specifically by race and ethnicity, is very different than in the high school level. We actually see that it's kind of flattens things out. So, for example, the spread is smaller for some of the different demographics. So, for example, for Hispanic, Latino, Latina, Latinx, we have a 20% and 17% spread for population and enrolled. But then if you look at the K through 5 population, it's a 22 to a 21% spread. Now, again, compare that with high school, and in that same demographic, it was 26 to 19. So 7% spread at the high school level, 3% spread at the middle school, and then a 1% spread at the elementary level. And my guess is the reason why is because they are not elective classes. Instead, these offerings are for everybody at the elementary level. At least from what we've seen nationwide, that tends to be what districts are doing. You're less likely to see the gifted or talented program or the honors program only doing coding and nobody else doing it. Instead, you're seeing entire districts or schools having all kids actually participate, which is awesome. Now, the spread is also found in like the economically disadvantaged students. So for example, the student population is 52%, but then 50% are enrolled at the elementary level. At the middle school level, it's 52 to 46. And then again, at the high school level, it's 52 to 38%. So again, we're seeing that in these district-wide elementary CS programs, assuming here that that's what the majority of these are, then you're getting a much lower spread between the percent of student population and those who are actually participating in computer science education courses, which is why at Boot Up, we are really focused on district-wide implementation. We are not just doing the honors and gifted. We are not just doing an after school. We want all students to participate. So on page 23, they focus on gender, and then they also focus on a breakdown of race or ethnicity. So for the gender side of things, they point out that in 2014 that only 20% were female. However, in 2020, 31% of AP computer science exam takers were female. And they also actually mentioned that 0.02% were, quote, another gender. I guess I would fall under that 0.02% as a non-binary person. It's nice to actually see that they're starting to include gender representation outside of male and female. Okay, so also on page 23, they have a breakdown between percent of student population and percent of exam takers based on race and ethnicity. So for Black or African American, it's 15% for student population and 6% who enroll in CS, specifically for the AP. For Hispanic, Latino, Latina, and Latinx, it's 26 to 16%. For Native American and Alaskan, it's 1% to 0.5%. For Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander, it's 0.4% to 0.15%. For white, it's 48 to 45%. For 2 or more races, it's 5 and 5%. And then for Asian, it's 5% student population and 27% enrolled in CS. So more than 5 times the percentage. Now on page 24, they actually break down the different race categories as well as gender categories. So they have the expected population, and then the CS exams for male and CS exams for female. So if you're interested in that, I highly recommend checking out that particular page, giving you a teaser on some of these, because I want you to actually read it. It's a good report to look at and to consider. On page 26, they do mention that there is a correlation, a strong correlation. Does not mean that it's causation, but it's the correlation between policy and implementation. So if you have a state that adopts one of those 9 standards or 9 policies that I mentioned earlier, then you're more likely to have higher access to computer science in schools. All right, so the next section, I'm going to go through many pages really fast and just kind of give you some highlights on the overall state across all of the United States. So for example, in 2017, there were 2 states that adopted a state plan over time, but in 2021, there's now 22. For standards in 2017, there were only 6 states that had it, but in 2021, there are now 39. For allocation of funding, there were 9 states in 2017, but there are now 31 in 2021. For teacher certificates in 2017, interestingly, there were 27 states that had teacher certificates. I imagine it was mainly in high school, but in 2021, there are now 41. For teacher preparation, there were 12 schools in 2017 that had some teacher preparation in higher education to help prepare CS educators. But in 2021, there's now 21 of them. Only 8 states in 2017 had a computer science supervisor, but in 2021, there's now 34. In 2017, only 4 states had a requirement for all high schools to offer CS, but in 2021, there's now 23 states. There were 28 states that had CS satisfy a core high school graduation requirement, but in 2017, there's now 51. That includes DC, as in Washington, DC. In higher education, in 2017, there were 13 states that allowed CS to satisfy a core admission requirement for getting into a higher ed program. But in 2021, there's now 21. And so those are kind of a very quick overview of all of the data that is kind of presented from pages 28 to 37. So if you want more information on any one of those, I definitely recommend checking out each one of those pages. Following this is the summary of each state. So they have 1 page per state, and then they have like appendices and like things like that at the end. What I'm going to do is just kind of give you a preview of what it looks like in my state, so in Arizona. So on the top left, they have a quick summary of the different policies. So the 9 policies on there. So they'll tell you, like, for the state plan, Arizona, no, they don't have a state plan. But they do have standards, they do have funding, they have certification. They don't have pre-service. They're in progress for a supervisor. They do not require all high schools to offer it. It is the district's decision whether it's a graduation requirement, and then there's no for admissions to get into a higher education institution. Now for these, they also have like a breakdown of some clarifications on some stuff. So like the supervisor says it's in progress, but then in the actual report, it says, quote, the AZ Department of Education is currently in the process of hiring a CS and educational technology specialist, end quote. It's from page 43. So for each one of these, you can kind of get a little quick highlight of those 9 different policies if it feels like it needs some kind of a clarification or an update since this report previously came out. Now, they also have interesting data specific to the states. So for example, in access by geography, in Arizona at least, 46% of urban schools had access, 49% of suburban, 19% of towns had access to computer science, and 29% in rural schools had access. And these are at high school offerings. If you look at the free and reduced lunch, for schools with less than 24%, only 38% have access. We go between 25 and 49, 64% have access. 50 and 74%, we have 52% with access. And then for schools with greater than 75%, of free and reduced lunch, it's 37%. So it's a pretty interesting little bell curve they have there. We also have some more information at the bottom of each one of these pages. So for example, for the enrollment by subgroup as comparison between student population and enrolled in CS, for English language learners, we have 7% population, but only 1% are enrolled in CS. For students with disabilities, we have 13% population and 10% enrolled. When we look at economic disadvantaged students, we have 44% in student population and 48% enrolled. And these are at high school levels, by the way. And then it also has a breakdown similarly between race and ethnicity. Now, I'm not going to read all of these, but what I do recommend is you actually go and find the name of your state or the District of Columbia and specifically take a look at the data that's presented here and see how is your state doing as a whole, and then potentially engaging in a conversation with your local like CSTA chapter, try and figure out what can we do to improve A, B, or C findings from this particular study. So again, I'll include a link to this in the show notes, but at the end of each one of these Unpacking Scholarship episodes, I like to do my lingering thoughts or some questions that I'd like to share. So one question that I have is what data aren't being explored and what questions aren't being asked for this kind of report? If you have an idea of some things that you think would be beneficial for the field to know about or that you'd like to know about, I do actually recommend reaching out to code.org, CSTA, and ESEP, because I know they are willing to engage in these discussions. We've had multiple conversations about this particular report while they were preparing it. So if you think of something that would be useful, share it with them. Now, the next comment that I have in like series of questions is around how of the 37 states that have the enrollment data, it appears that 4.7% are enrolled in a CS foundational course at the high school level, which is interesting. So one question that I have about that is what percentage would you personally be happy with for students taking at least one CS course? And why that percentage? So for some background, for some context, my background's in music education, and there's often discussion about reaching the other 80% within the field. So that is referencing an earlier study that showed that 20% of high school students were participating in some kind of a music class or program at their school. So music educators are constantly trying to figure out how do we get the other 80%. Now, in a more recent publication that I'll include a link to, it's around 25% that are actually enrolled in high school at the time of that publication. So for you, would 25% of kids taking CS courses choosing to elect to do that? Is that okay with you? Or would you like a higher or lower number? And why is that? Now, if you are somebody who thinks that it should be a higher number than either the 4.7% or even higher than the 25%, then I guess a question that you might consider is what might CS educators learn from other subject areas about how and why they have higher enrollment numbers? So for example, with the music programs, they often have multiple pathways to participate by either performing in a variety of different ensembles, maybe engaging in some recording and producing classes, maybe a class on composing, maybe a class on analyzing and studying theory or music appreciation, etc. in different genres and styles. So what could something like that look like for CS education? Would it be, hey, we have a class in app development, but we also have a class in game development, maybe a class on cybersecurity, AI, etc.? Maybe that's something that could help increase enrollment and broaden participation. I don't know. But what I do recommend is actually looking at those subject areas, specifically the ones where people elect to be there, they are choosing to be there, and try and figure out, well, why is it that they have such a higher percentage than CS education? Now, another more critical question to consider is how do you as an individual or even the field respond when some demographics disproportionately outweigh others, either in your program or in the field? So for example, when it appears that Asian high school students attend CS classes at more than double the percentage rate of students in a school, or more than 5 times the rate for AP courses, now the field has clearly responded by trying to increase the number of other races or ethnicities. But what about in scenarios where there aren't enough devices, teachers, or openings in a class, and you have to make some kind of a decision about who to let into your class? So for example, the Media Arts and Makerspace elective class that I ran for the middle school had a waiting list. I was not in charge of that waiting list, the assistant principal was, and so they had to figure out who they were going to let into the class for the elective. Now, some of the kids, when they were writing down their elective, they would write down my class only and not do any other rank ordering. And they'd specifically write down comments like, I will not participate in any other class. Do not sign me up for anything other than this one, which is great that students really wanted to be there. But what if we had 40 kids who all said the same thing and there was only 35 openings in that class? What kind of decisions would the assistant principal have had to make on who to let in? And why? So for example, one thing that we need to consider when looking at these numbers is if you were in this scenario, best case scenario, you have way too many kids who want to participate in computer science education, then you have time in the day to actually teach. And maybe your school can't afford to hire more CS educators. So would you turn students away from a demographic that is overrepresentative in favor of students from a demographic that is underrepresented within your program? So for example, going off of the data that's on here, might you turn away some Asian students in favor of Hispanics, Latino, Latina, or Latinx students? So in that particular demographic scenario, if you're okay with turning away some students in favor of another, are you okay with turning away students on 504 plans in favor of students who aren't on a 504 plan? And why? Their percentage was also higher, but they're also simultaneously within an underrepresented group, depending on what's on their 504. And then what about the intersections of those different demographics? So what about an Asian student who's not in a 504 with a Hispanic student who is in a 504? What do you do then? I obviously don't have answers to this. I can't make those decisions for you, but it's something to consider because it might end up happening to you. I know it's happened to other educators that I've spoken with who do have waiting lists to get into their classes. However, I want to ask some questions now that it's more of a critique of the discourse around CS for all. So in particular, my question that I've brought up before in this podcast is, at what point would you be willing to admit that not every subject area is going to be of interest to everyone? And if we problematize that kind of discourse a little bit more, where's the line for when pushing for participation over access becomes a form of colonization, like axiological colonization? Colonizing the values of another group or another identity. So for example, what if there's a particular community or minority identity or group or culture, etc., that just fundamentally doesn't have interest in computer science education? Quick one that comes to mind is maybe the Amish community is not interested in cybersecurity. That's just a guess. I don't actually know. This is just hypothetical. So if we broke down demographics and found a low percentage of Amish students taking or electing to take AP classes in high school, would we then, as a field, say, no, you must do this? Or would we ask the question of, well, why is it that they're not interested in it? Maybe it's just fundamentally a disagreement about the value of computer science for that particular identity. Another question related to this is, okay, so if everyone is required to take CS in elementary and middle school, but they're still choosing to not participate in high school, maybe they just don't like the field quite like you or I do. I love it, but I don't expect everyone else to. One of the things that I brought up is in this podcast is that when I first started teaching drumline, I was like, oh, everyone's going to love this the way that I do. This is the greatest thing ever, and I want everyone to know that. And then I started working with students, and some of them agreed, while others were like, yeah, I like this, but like my real passion is hockey, so I'd rather do that. Or my real passion is drawing. I'd rather do that. This I just kind of do for the fun. So maybe it's the same thing for CS education. Not everyone's going to want to go into this field, and that's okay. I do think it's an important field of study that has a huge impact on society. However, I think it's also equally important for people to study nutrition or psychology or communication, culinary arts, kinesthetics, etc. If each one of those domains had a for-all movement, like nutrition for all, wouldn't that inevitably dilute everything that we are doing in the other subject areas because there's not enough time in the day to learn everything? So if instead of having, arbitrarily throwing out numbers here, like 10 required subject areas, we have 15, that takes away time from those other subject areas that are required, or even the elective courses. What if we eventually, a few decades from now, have 20 subject areas instead of 10? Then we're just kind of skimming on the surface of things rather than actually being able to dive deep and actually develop some expertise in something. Which is why I'm much more in favor of, hey, we should focus on access and find out reasons for barriers to entry and participation, but I don't necessarily think we should force everybody to take something that we are interested in, because maybe, fundamentally, they're just not interested in it. And they have really good reasons why, we just don't know them yet. That was a long rant. It was informed by many other articles and discussions that I've had, including the one that I just had with GT and John. So thank you, both of you, for helping me think through that. Hopefully it makes sense. If it doesn't, feel free to just reach out to me. I'm more than happy to chat through this. Just kind of sharing some ramblings, or considerations rather. There's a contact me button on my website, so feel free to reach out. Happy to chat. Speaking of, you can find the show notes on my website at jaredoleary.com, where there's hundreds, if not thousands, of free resources. If, even after this rant, you still would like to potentially partner on a grant and collaborate, let me know. Reach out to me. Stay tuned next week for another episode, and until then, I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.